Welcome back to Somm Sessions. My name is Lars, Leicht, and on behalf of the Somm Journal, the Somm Foundation, Treasury Wine Estates, I'd like to welcome you back and also introduce my partner in crime here, Gillian Ballance, MS. Welcome, Gillian.
Hey, Lars. Thank you. I can't believe this is our last Somm Sesh. It's been really great to do these educational webinars with you. It's been really amazing to partner with Somm Journal, the Somm Foundation, all of my team here, Treasury, the boots on the ground that have been pulling these presentations together and getting the wine shipped to you all, which I hope you guys have your beautiful bottle of Knights Valley Cabernet Sauvignon, because that's the topic for today. And looking forward to tasting this wonderful wine with all of you. And just want to thank you all in advance for participating and making this program incredibly successful. I've received a lot of personal messages from people who said, you know, this really helped me get through crazy pandemic times. And so that's what it's all about. It's our way to engage and enrich the sommelier community with this great scholarship program and these wonderful webinars. So thank you all in advance, and I will hand it over to Lars to kick it off with our Knights Valley and Beringer presentation.
Fantastic. Thanks, Gillian. Yeah, you know what? I'm very proud of being part of this whole effort with our partners, the Somm Journal, Somm Foundation, and Treasury, just offering great educational information, which is very proud of that. So let's keep up that tradition and move forward. So Gillian, if you'd switch to the next slide for me. Which is also my background, my virtual background. You see what we're talking about today, where Sonoma and Napa meet. You see that county line running down there. But one of the things you notice is that there are really only two major crossovers, Highway 12 down by Los Caneros and Highway 128 further up north. And that's sort of our focus area, that northern boundary today. So I'm going to ask you to go to the next slide, and we're going to zoom in a little bit, and you see right where Knights Valley sits. And it almost seems like Napa kind of flows right into Knights Valley. And literally, with the exception of this little tiny ridge where the Mayacamas kind of hang a right turn from the western range to heading east, that makes this little bump as you're driving in along 128, and you come into Knights Valley, which is a relatively small valley, certainly compared to Napa Valley. But in many ways, it could almost be considered an extension of Napa Valley, even though it's got that little ridge that separates it, because it's to the far east of Sonoma. It's Sonoma's easternmost valley, easternmost AVA. And you can see it's well protected from what Sonoma is really known for, is that sea influence, the Pacific influence, that cooling influence. So it's also Sonoma's warmest AVA. And you look at it and it almost looks like, you know, the map maker or the politicians or the gerrymanderers, whatever they were, could have taken that Knights Valley and very easily slid it onto the Napa side. But for whatever reason, it went to Sonoma. And it kind of reminds me, being of an East Coaster, Gillian, if you slide to the next map, it reminds me of the situation we have here with Maine. You know, Maine, I guess, could have been touch and go. It could have been Canada. It could have been the US. There are parts of Maine that are further north than Quebec City and Montreal, which is kind of neat. It just sticks right up there, and it actually separates two different parts of Canada. So just a little, that's the way my mind works. And Knights Valley can kind of go that way. So let's talk a little bit more about Knights Valley. Tremendous history. And this is the kind of stuff that I don't know that you can say in general dreams are made of, but my goodness, these are the kind of things that I dream of. A land grant in the 1800s. You had the Mexico as a big nation, to the point where they were able to give these tremendous land grants to people that did years of service. I would love to work for a winery and get a land grant. Wouldn't that be fun? But in 1843, the Mexican government gave part of Rancho Malacomes to this gentleman, Berriesa, and he had it for a while. And then, of course, the tide shifted. California became part of the U.S., became its own republic, and then part of the U.S. And so obviously, I think Berriesa headed back to Mexico, And this very astute gentleman named Thomas Knight, again, talk about being in the right place at the right time. Very astute gentleman named Thomas Knight said, I'll take you up on that fire sale and I'll buy some land from you. He purchased 9,000 acres of the Rancho Malacomes from Berryessa and started planting his vineyards there. It was ideal land for vineyards. In 1875, again, it must be great to be king, because this guy, you know, in Europe, he might have gotten knighted. In the U.S., they just named a valley after him instead of that, and so it became known as Knight's Valley after this gentleman, Thomas Knight. Again, how cool is that? And it was a very, very popular grape growing area until Prohibition. It was well known for its grapes, well known for its wines, and Prohibition really, really knocked it hard. It knocked all of California hard, but because Knights Valley was a little bit more remote, it was sort of the last one to get any trickle. It wasn't really until the mid 70s or early 80s that it started getting back recovering. So over 50 years from Prohibition, think about that, before it was able to recover again. And there was this little town there called Kellogg, Kellogg, unlike the cereal, two G's. And this little town had great hopes back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, after Calistoga was founded. They said, we're going to compete with Calistoga just over the ridge. We're going to be as good as, if not better than, Calistoga. And I always like to think that if Kellogg had a similar situation, supposedly the legend of why Calistoga is called Calistoga is because somebody said that this was going to be the Saratoga of California, and sort of flipped the words and said the Calistoga of Sarafornia. But imagine if somebody from Kellogg had said that we're going to be the Sonatoga of Calanoma. I don't know if that would have worked. But Kellogg was a neat little town and had great hopes. But as I said, Prohibition kind of nailed it. And then you had the Depression, and back in the 1960s, there was a tremendous fire that literally wiped out the town. And the town was pretty much the only town, the only show in that area. And the area has remained very, very rural and bucolic since. Part, that's the way the residents and the wine growers there want to keep it. And I would argue that it's probably one of the only, if not the only, California wine country or wine country in the world that has gotten more bucolic since the turn of the 20th century.
It's a good point. And, you know, there's still some of those buildings from the town of Kellogg that are on Peter Michael's property, which is just across from, the church. And I think a little school situated right on the property there. So kind of neat.
Yeah. Yeah. Little, sort of like a ghost town. Sounds like a Hollywood prop. Maybe they'll film a cowboy movie there or something. So looking at the next slide, we talk about Knights Valley today. Back in 1983, when they put together the first AVAs for Sonoma, Knights Valley was included in it. And it's literally a handful of growers. I mean, 30 is a big handful, but it's still, relatively speaking, a handful when you think about the other areas, about 2,000 planted acres. And as I said earlier, it's really one of the most rural corners of Sonoma. So Gillian, can you tell us a little bit more about Knights Valley as an AVA, some of the rules and the actual happenstance of the geology and the geography there?
I sure can. But I just want to go back to this slide because I think it really illustrates, like you mentioned, Lars, those AVAs or sub-AVAs of Sonoma that kind of push inland really do focus on Cabernet Sauvignon, Bordeaux varietals. You know, you can see all of those that are touching Knights Valley, Alexander Valley, Chalk Hill. You know, those are really dominated by Cabernet Sauvignon plantings and Zin versus, you know, those really cool sort of coastal areas. So I just like this map because it really points out the climatic diversity of Sonoma. And you can really speak to also just different varietals that are successful and where.
Well, the other neat thing about this map is it shows us the Russian River, and the Russian River ancient times used to go straight through Knights Valley heading toward Napa, but there was an eruption from the ancient volcanoes there, and it diverted the river. You can see, it looks like just as it gets to Chalk Hill, the Russian River changes its mind and wants to go back.
Yeah, it does. It makes this really crazy, curvy thing. Just like, nope, not going to Knights Valley. But yeah, those are some, I just wanted to point that out. And that's another great point about how the Russian River kind of took a left turn.
Yeah.
So yeah, Knights Valley AVA, and you know, I can't say enough amazing things about really the pioneering spirit of the Behringer family for recognizing this as, like we've said, that extension to Napa Valley. And of course, they were already extremely well established in Napa and certainly responsible for helping to create some of those sub AVAs. They sought out some really incredible vineyards and planted and developed vineyards up on Hell Mountain and down on the valley floor off of Glass Mountain. So very, very, I think, influential in terms of this idea of finding these great pockets of vineyards. And I'm sure as Napa Valley was starting to expand and the demand of the wines grew, it really was beneficial for the Behringer family to seek out, well, where can we kind of emulate this style of Napa Valley? What's going to work, because the boundaries were not expanding. And so voila, you have the purchase of the 600-acre ranch today that we still farm. And that happened in the late 60s with the first vintage of our actual Knights Valley Cabernet Sauvignon in 1974, which is pretty exciting. Yeah. But as you mentioned, the Russian River was diverted. Because of the Mayacamas range, it's fairly protected from the Pacific Ocean, kind of those mitigating influences. However, still kind of opens up a little bit to the Petaluma Gap, just a touch, but yeah, definitely considered to be prime Cabernet region Bordeaux varietals, those thicker skin varietals. Yeah. Also known for these huge diurnal shifts. And, I was saying to you earlier before we got on with our participants, it's going to be 35 degrees here in the morning tomorrow, high of 77. So when we're talking large diurnal swings, we're not kidding. No. But it definitely helps during the growing season. It's a little nail biting here because we've had bud break pretty much all throughout Napa and also those also Knights Valley. But lots of Cabernet Sauvignon planted here. These really nice, like volcanic and alluvial deposits on our ranch. And just a very, we have this incredibly 50 years of experience of growing grapes in the area. And as you mentioned, yes, it is more bucolic. It's grown even more rural. And there's only about 2,000 acres under vine here, but the total area is somewhere close to 40. So not a lot of grape growing. There's a theory that there are, these parts of Knights Valley, and when you drive through the valley, you can see these gigantic blue rocks that jut out of the soil, and there's this what's known as blue serpentine soils, and these rocks where it's just not suitable for viticulture. So I think that just adds to the really unique and special place that we have with our ranch at Knights Valley. Yeah. So yeah, the family purchased the land here in the late 50s, began to utilize Knights Valley on the label, and in fact helped to gain its official AVA status in 1983. And today we cover a third of the plantings of the AVA, roughly a third, maybe a little bit more. And our ranch is about 600 acres in size, all planted primarily to Bordeaux varietals with a little bit of Sangiovese that we do just for the tasting room. So really, again, just kudos to the Behringer family for recognizing the potential of this area. I think it's really, really neat. A couple weeks ago, we had the incredible opportunity of tasting every vintage
Wow, that's quite a lineup.
The labels changed quite a bit. I think it's gotten a lot sexier over the days. And it's really interesting too, when you look at these wines from the early 70s into the 80s, to read the back label, where winemakers actually put pH levels,
Wow.
Brix levels when the grapes were harvested, percentages of the varietals, so even though we didn't have a lot of really like recorded history from winemaking teams, we could read it all on the back label, which
That's awesome.
very seldom see today. And I think that, as if you were a participant in our Behringer seminar, the history of kind of just, again, the pioneering spirit of the Behringers that started back in 1875. So, and winemaking, of course, has shifted, right? In general, we are experiencing slightly warmer temperatures of last decade or so. And you look at these cooler years of the 70s, 80s, when we were harvesting fruit a lot earlier too, we didn't want to take chances. These wines have some really beautiful acidity and ageability. And I think for a wine that is, sub $30 retail, but has 40 years worth of cellaring is a pretty cool opportunity, right? I want to start a cellar,
Amazing.
but I can't spend $1,000 on a case of wine. Here's your solution, our lovely Behringer Knights Valley. I don't know, Lars, if you have a history with this wine. I certainly feel like it's very globally recognized. A lot of people know and trust this wine. Like if you know a Behringer wine, it's probably the Knights Valley Cabernet Sauvignon, because of the size of the ranch. We're able to really produce a lot. So it's great for by the glass programs. It's great, again, on retail shelves. But I'm wondering if you have any experience with Knights Valley prior to today, with Knights Valley being in your glass.
You know what? I don't. I wish I did. I certainly knew of it and always heard of it. It's one of those iconic wines. Always garners a lot of respect. I love the fact that you're saying that they have a lot of tech card info on the back labels. That almost becomes sort of a time capsule for these wines. And I certainly didn't realize that the wine was that historic. So this is pretty fascinating to understand just how far back it goes. And it's sort of a sleeper in a way.
It really is. And again, I was just astounded by the ageability of these wines all the way up to the current vintages. So,
well, again, that's that cool climate, the diurnal shifts and volcanic soil. It gives it that nice level of acidity that really helps it, makes it a food wine, and also gives it the durability to age a little bit.
Yeah, and I don't claim to be an expert on Knights Valley, but I think we might have one.
That would be nice.
Wouldn't that be nice? Somebody with a lot of experience of farming fruit here, and of course producing the wine. So Ryan Rapp is our senior winemaker and Knights Valley expert, I think, is popping on.
He's on.
I am.
Oh, I don't see you, but I'm glad you're on.
I can see you, which is good though.
Oh, there you are. Yay. Yeah. So I'm just, Ryan, every time you talk about Knights Valley or anything for that matter, wine related, you're just an incredible resource for information, but specifically with regards to Knights Valley. And I know that you are really passionate about this ranch as well. So if you want to enlighten all of us, our participants, I'm sure maybe you chimed on a couple minutes early and cover off on anything that we didn't cover off on, or what makes this area so special to you.
Hey, Gillian, can I just suggest, I'm sorry, Gillian or Megan, maybe we could take the share screen down so we could get a better look at Ryan's expressions as he tells us about the
wine. Bold him.
There we go. I did pop on a few minutes early, and I definitely any conversation about Knights Valley I really enjoy. So I did want to hear some of your guys' thoughts too. For me, I am super passionate about the place for a lot of reasons. One, viticulturally, it's super special. You described a lot of the reasons why it is as special as it is. But two, for me as a winemaker, it's kind of a unique, very rare thing where you get to work with an AVA top to bottom. So, if you think about all of Sonoma County, all of Napa County, it's very rare as a winemaker you get to work with vineyards from the entire AVA. And our ranch alone encompasses a huge part of the AVA. I think you had a third up there. That sounds about right to me. But then on top of that, we've worked with some of the families over the years from north to south, and there's not a place in that valley we haven't worked with. So, for me, it's one of the few times I get to see everything, which is really cool. One thing Lars did touch on a second ago that I have just a little bit of a tweak on is, there is that big diurnal fluctuations that does preserve a lot of the acidity, but really what preserves a lot is actually heat, not necessarily the cool temperatures. Because when it gets really hot, the vines shut down just like it's when it's cold. They treat the heat like it's cold and they shut down, they stop producing, and you don't get as much acid metabolism. So that's what preserves a lot of that acidity. But the ranch itself, you did a great job describing it, so I won't go too much into that. But really what makes the spot unique for us is it sits on a really old riverbed. So while our vineyard sits on the valley floor, it is really primarily farms like a mountaintop vineyard, and that's because of how rocky our soils are. So if you look at some of the maps and you read some of the history, you can actually see where the Russian River used to flow down all the way through Alexander Valley and then cut down into Knights and flow into the Napa River. And then there was a geological event. The landslide vineyard sits right there that actually caused the Russian River to churn. And what that did was that left Knights just this really kind of old riverbed with rocks, not the big alluvial fans or rich soils you would see on a lot of riverbeds, but it's really just kind of a rocky spot. So dead flat, but farms just like our mountaintop vineyards that we get out of Howell, that we get out of even Mount Veeder, just really restrictive soils, and we get really small berries. And to Lars' point a little while ago, it preserves a lot of acidity too, which makes it a really cool spot.
That's awesome.
Knights Valley, I'm assuming?
Yeah.
What vintage?
We have the 2018, which I think this is my first time to taste it because we didn't do it when we did that large retrospective. So I'm excited.
No, it would have just been getting released. So, 2018 was a fairly warm vintage for us. It wasn't as warm as certainly 15 or 16, but definitely coming off of 2017, it was actually a little bit warmer, kind of back to more of that kind of traditional style of vintage that we've had. But it was a long one. So we started picking late September and went clear until probably the second week in November on our vineyard. So, which when you think about it, it's kind of crazy. It's, it's all, you mentioned earlier, it's all of Bordeaux varieties, and you got an entire month where they're ripening. So that really kind of speaks to not only the varieties, but then just kind of the varieties of soil that we see from top to bottom in that little valley.
Now, Cabernet is king in Knights Valley, but what else is in that vineyard, and what else is in this bottle?
So our vineyard is really, it's a Bordeaux blend. So we do have Malbec, we have Petit Verdot, we have Merlot, we have some Cabernet Franc. Actually, Cabernet Franc's probably the second most that we've got planted there, but then we also work with a couple of vineyards where we get quite a bit of Merlot. So those would be the other two big varieties that we work with. Just a smattering of Malbec, because a little bit goes a long ways. And then really like the Petit Verdot that we get off our vineyard. But where it sits is it's really restrictive. So there's only a very small place where it'll actually grow pretty well. So we just got a little bit there, but I use that quite a bit.
I definitely get the warmth of the vintage, Ryan, but it still has this really nice lift and acidity to it as well.
I think a lot of that's just, the fact that it comes out of Sonoma County. That is that little slight difference of just sitting just north of Napa there, where we do get those diurnal fluctuations. A lot of that acidity is preserved. And then those berries are just a lot smaller. So they're a little bit more concentrated, not only in flavor, and tannin, but also acid too.
And kind of lacking maybe like a jammy note that you
for
those warmer areas.
Exactly. And we're not going for that with the Knights Valley. That's definitely not, for me. I really want, especially any wines I make, I want the vineyard to really speak for itself. And that jammy style just doesn't lend itself. There's so many beautiful notes we get out of there. For me, I get a lot of, 18 was a year that I got a lot of the lavender notes you see out of it, a lot of those nice bright boysenberry flavors, really just those bright style of Cabernet.
And my technical notes say 25% new French oak.
Yep, that's correct. So it's, one of the things that we do with all of our wines, but this one included, is we try to balance out the amount of oak that we're using. So I really want the oak to be seamless. And when you start talking about the type of tannin that we extract out of Knights Valley and the quantity, really just a small touch in the oak is really what it needs to be, that kind of seamless note. So it's just enough to kind of lift the fruit, but not so much to overpower some of that elegance that we get off the vineyard itself.
About how much time?
So about 18 months. Well, anywhere from 16 to 18 months, depending on the year.
Okay.
Yeah, lots of boysenberry, blackberry. I love always the savory kind of elements that I get in Knights Valley, and it varies from vintage to vintage, but it either comes off as lavender or some sort of savory herb note,
Yeah.
But I really love that unique character.
And it's pretty amazing to me that savory note that we talk about with Knights a lot, how much it does change vintage to vintage. And I couldn't even say it's warm or cool, because in some cool years, we'll see just as much of that lavender note. And then some warm years, we'll kind of see more of that kind of almost herb de Provence. So it's really unique to the soil there.
Are you at all concerned about these incredible shifts in temperature we're having right now, especially just following bud break?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it just from one season at a time perspective, this is definitely a much earlier season than what we've seen in the last few years, and certainly a lot warmer right away. And you see it out in the vineyard. You obviously see the vines pushing hard right away. You see everything in the vineyard growing. So that's going to take those vines. You're going to see a lot of vegetable growth right away. So they're going to be putting energy into that instead of the grapes. So you get a little bit concerned about that. But, one thing I always remind myself, it's a long season, and really what determines whether or not for us it's going to be a good season or not is once we hit veraison on, is really the weather patterns after that is really what determines it for how we see it's going to go.
Very cool. Megan, do we have any questions out there that maybe Ryan could answer? Any questions for Ryan? Oh, here we go.
One just popped in. Look at that.
Yeah. Ryan, when you're deciding upon your oak regimen, do you make that decision at harvest, after fermentation, or some other time? That's a really awesome question.
Great question. The best way to do it's so specifically around Knights with reds, we're tasting the fermenters as we go. So we're extracting the tannin, we're looking at the quality of the tannin and the quantity of the tannin that's coming out. And that's when I'm deciding how much oak to use and what kind of toast. A lot of it you have to buy ahead of time, so you can't do too much. You got to have a rough idea of what you're doing. But ultimately, the tweaks are going to be based off of what we're tasting while things are fermenting. With whites, it's completely different. With whites, I'm making those decisions in the vineyard. It's going to be based on the ripeness, the phenolic characters I'm getting out of any of those whites. That I'll decide early on what I'm going to use.
We have a question from Hubert as well, asking if the fires have had any effect up in Knights Valley.
No, that's a great question. Knights Valley, definitely, we've had fires dancing around the valley for the last few years. Certainly up in Alexander Valley last year, and then obviously northern Napa last year. The year we actually did have some late season on the northern end of Knights, very late. We were actually 100% picked at that point, but we did actually have some of the creek beds with our vineyard actually burn on top of that. When I think about it, we've had fires in the area since 2015. There's no reason to think that this year is going to be different. So it's winemaker, it's trying to figure out how to mitigate it. As a person who lives here, it's just trying to make sure we're doing the right things and keeping people safe. So,
yeah, keeping people safe. You said it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Knights Valley, our vineyard is it's all sustainably farmed, right? Are you involved in that lengthy laundry list of requirements and showing improvements? And I must imagine that you're really a big part of that review process. And if you could explain to participants maybe a little bit about that. I know for me, until I dove deep into sustainability and how important it is to Treasury, I didn't really understand a lot of the things, but maybe you could just touch on some of the sustainability factors in terms of agriculture or viticulture versus what you do at the winery. Maybe a quick explanation would be great.
Sure. My biggest impact's obviously going to be at the winery, but certainly been a huge part of the vineyard part of it. When you think about a brand like Beringer, we've been making wines for over 140 years. I want to be making wines for another 140 years. So sustainability is a huge part of it. when you start thinking about a piece of land in those terms, you can't think about what you're doing this season. You got to think the long term. So all of our vineyards very early on were either going through the certification process of being sustainable or were sustainable. But there's, when you look at it, there's not really one body anymore. So we probably actually participate in about 6 different ones. A few off the top of my head are the fish friendly farming, obviously sustainable. We don't certified organic farms, but it's stuff we've certainly explored. It's things that we've explored in some of the spots where it would make sense. But the biggest impact for me is that's got to translate to the winery and what I do. We can do everything right out in the vineyard, and then if I bring things into the winery and we aren't doing the right thing, like conserving water, conserving energy, then none of that really matters. So we've undergone a huge program at the winery for the last 5 years to actually look at our water consumption. I'm not sure most people realize this, but it takes 7 gallons on average of water to produce 1 gallon of wine. So that was an industry standard when I was going to school. That number has come down. I believe the industry standard is closer to 5. And we actually look at that every single year. And I think on site, we're down to about 3.5 gallons of water per wine. And, a lot of that just comes back to updating equipment, looking at how we do some of our processes. Water is a big one for us. If you look at how we impact not only the environment, but water is a huge one. The other one's electricity. It takes a lot of electricity to make wine, obviously keeping any of our barrel shays cold or keeping tanks cold during fermentation. So we've actually looked at trying to use a lot more technology around our tanks. So when you think of a wine tank, I think most people think of it as something pretty simple. But when we start investing a little bit of technology and what's the best way to cool it? What's the most efficient way to do it from an energy standpoint? It's allowed us to take our energy use down by about 20% over the last year, and we're still working on that. So
that's awesome. And I'm going to steal that from you. Behringer's been making wine for over 140 years. We want to continue that for another 140.
I mean, it's the best way to think about it. Think about some of the vineyards we have. Certainly the historic home site. Grapes have been growing here for at least 140 years. We got to keep doing it. So
yeah, the only way to do that is by preserving our precious resources like water and energy.
You're really open to it because I think the one thing that goes along with this is I think there's everyone has this idea that maybe there's one sustainable body or one way to do it right, but there's so many different versions of it out there depending on where you're at. I think being open to it and figuring out what's right for your site is what makes the most sense for us.
Yeah, and I mean Napa is a good example because there's Napa Green certification for your vineyards, and then there's Napa Green certification for your winery, and there's so there really are there's just a laundry list of things that you have to provide to continue and maintain the certification. And I think in California, from the Sustainable Wine Growers Association, they said something like 70% of our vineyards are sustainable up here in the North Coast, which is great. It's a great testament to California's, just this movement towards sustainability and protecting resources. And you're a part of that.
Yeah, and at least for us, a lot of it was, like you said, you have to go through the certification process, but a lot of it was stuff we were already doing because it's just the right thing to do as a business. So the certifications are great, but the best part was it was stuff that we were already kind of included in our plan. The winery is definitely on Napa Green certification. I believe almost all of our vineyards, if not all, are on the Napa Green certification as well. So
yeah. So back to the wine, Lars, I'm going to pick on you just for a moment because it's only 11:30 here. All I've had is a smoothie this morning and some coffee, and now I'm jumping in to my Knights Valley breakfast wine. But you're a little further on into
past lunchtime. Yeah,
you might be thinking about lunch or food. What pops into your mind when you taste this one?
Oh, anything with a good shot of herbs to it, like a nicely herbed roasted chicken with some herbs too, because I get a lot of that. You mentioned before about the Provence spice mix, the Mediterranean spice mix. I even get a little bit of what the Italians call macchia mediterranea, that brush to the wine. So I think anything like that, a good roasted, some barbecued pork, nice spice rubbed ribs would go great with this.
Okay. If you could just, after this, just Google the Rutherford Grill menu and just text
Tell
me
me
and
what
let
you want me to
know.
order you.
Yeah, because I'm gonna, like, head over there with my 2018 Knights Valley pretty soon. Okay, we had a couple more questions come in for you, Ryan. How would you compare the Knights Valley cab to private reserve, which a lot of participants got to try back in December when private reserve was our focus? Is the climate overall much cooler in the Knights Valley?
That's a great question. Climate-wise, a little tough to compare. So when you think about Knights Valley primarily from us, even though we've worked with multiple vineyards, primarily comes from one really small area. Private reserve really comes from all over Napa Valley. So if you know any of the history behind private reserve, which hopefully you guys talked about, for us, it is what we think is the best in class out of Napa every year. So we're pulling from different sources depending on the vintage. Primarily it comes off of Howell Mountain. We get a lot off of Spring Mountain and then some off the valley floor around us as well. Some in Oakville, but a lot of it in the St. Helena appellation. And private reserve is a selection every single year of what we think is the best vineyard, the best block within that vineyard. So if you think about some of those hillside vineyards, sometimes the top's a little bit better than the bottom or vice versa, depending on how the year goes. And then what we think are the best fermentation. So what I've been able to extract, what I think are the best tannins. Then on top of that, it's a barrel selection. So private reserve is really kind of meant to be a wine that's very large in volume and tannin, really very ageable. Knights Valley, for me, is really about a focus on that vineyard. So it really is about the focus on the AVA and the vineyard. And I'm trying to express what I think out of Knights Valley should be coming every single year. So still primarily off of our vineyard. The other small vineyards I work with is for just doing some, bringing in a little bit more Merlot or bringing in some of the cooler parts for a Cabernet, but really just an expression of Knights Valley. So kind of different in style, different in construct, but style-wise pretty similar.
Here's another one. Are you worried about needing to introduce new grapes into the mix here? I'm thinking this question is surrounding global warming, like Bordeaux, which has started planting a lot of experimental varietals.
It's definitely something that's on our mind. It's something that we experiment with. We'll plant small plantings in some of our vineyards of looking at different varieties that are maybe not as traditional, some of the Bordeaux varieties that we have planted. So far, at least in California, it's not something that's been as much of an issue, say it is in Europe, because we actually can do a little bit of manipulation. By manipulation, I mean irrigate. We can irrigate our vineyards, which you can't always do in Europe, which makes a big difference from a winemaking perspective. And those are the things that allows us to maybe not be as far along the curve as far as climate change goes, but it is something that we're looking at and very cognizant of.
Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to go ahead.
There's a question about our plans to use solar panels, and we already do. I think I read something about 691 households worth of energy come off of our solar panels.
It sounds about right. So we had the largest solar panel installation at the time. There's been a few larger since, but I still think one of the largest in the wine industry about 12 years ago. So it's not something that we've just started dabbling in. So if you think about one neat thing about a winery is we have lots of buildings. We have lots of areas, so it's a great place to be putting up solar panels on top and utilize it. So it's something that we've been heavily into and actually are already looking at what those next steps are. Is it more solar? Is it using geothermal? So when I mentioned earlier what we do at the winery as far as trying to reduce energy, that's how we do it. I mean, that's a huge part of how we do it is just look at what those sources are.
Would it ever be possible to dry farm in the Knights Valley? Does it, do the soils lend themselves to that at all so that irrigation would just be an emergency, a first aid situation?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So to go into some of the details on how we irrigate in Knights Valley. So I mentioned earlier, it's basically where our vineyard sits is an old riverbed. So when you think about that, the water table below that's not real current at the moment. And the river hasn't flown through there in, thousands of years. So wells aren't a huge part of what we do. And we actually have 3 ponds on site where we collect rainwater. We actually have some collecting cisterns, is probably the best word to come up with, for water that's coming off the hill to pump into those ponds. And that is the water that we use to irrigate the vineyard right now. As far as dry farming goes, there are areas where dry farming makes sense. Knights Valley is not one because of those rocky soils I mentioned. So if you think about how rocky those soils are, what's important about that is they're extremely well drained. So there isn't really holding capacity of water there. And a huge part of dry farming is going to be, there's got to be some holding capacity of water. So when you get rainfall, or you get just, you know, a little bit of fog coming down to actually get that soil wet, you got that soil, you got that holding capacity to get some of the water up. So we do look at ways as far as our irrigation goes to, you know, not have a massive impact. But, you know, dry farming really only makes sense at certain sites, not every single site.
Right. And I mean, it sounds like your irrigation program is itself, in and of itself, pretty sustainable.
It is, absolutely. And, you know, initially, I'll, you know, be as transparent as I can. You know, when it was developed in the 70s, it was out of necessity. Nowadays, it's absolutely, it's what we'd be doing. So, you know, it's a little bit different.
And Gillian, I don't know if you see that last question. That's just sort of an off topic, but maybe a fun question is, and maybe this is a fantasy question for Ryan, is would you ever want to make 100% Petit Verdot or 100% Merlot from Beringer, from the Knights Valley? Is that something that would ever be interesting to do, or needs
Convince the bean counters that you want to make 100%?
You know, yeah, absolutely. And we look at that. We actually have a few wines in our tasting room that are not part of the blend. There's a couple things. First off, you know, when you start thinking about, you know, as far as a fantasy blend out of Knights Valley, you know, for me, that's what our Knights Valley Reserve program is. So I mentioned the process we go through for private reserve. We actually do the same thing for our Knights Valley Reserve. So we make a regular Knights Valley, then there's a reserve on top of that. It's a much smaller bottling. And that is because, you know, I mentioned you get these just little gems out of the vineyard. So we do bottle that and sell that separate. As far as other varieties, there is a beautiful block of Merlot that sits on the northern half in the back, kind of up against the west side hills there, that I've been working on the tasting room to try to get something going with, because I think it's probably the most elegant, you know, just really acid driven Merlot that I could probably make out of some of the grapes we get, which would be really interesting to me. So just working on that one a little bit, but yeah, definitely always have hopes of that.
acid driven Merlot? That almost sounds like a contradiction in terms.
I know it does, especially in California.
Excellent.
Yes,
Well, Ryan, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to join us and give us all those great insights into winemaking, sustainability. We really, really do appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed talking about night. To share it with everyone. So
anytime.
yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, guys.
thank you.